On July 2nd, 1888, the shade side of Cedar Bluff's church porch measured 101 degrees by noon for the sixth day in a row, and the iron handle on the communal well windlass burned palms through cloth as men and women took their turn at a rope that yielded less each hour. The settlement sat in the Colorado Territory, above a narrow, stubborn reach of the Arkansas River. With 286 souls and one deep shaft, the town trusted more than weather, more than rumor, more than caution. At sunrise, that well had shown less than 9 feet of standing water, down from 41 feet in spring. And by afternoon, even the bucket bottoms brought up a wet grit that smelled of silt and warm stone. Stock tanks at the edge of town had cracked to patterned clay. Laundry lines hung still under a dry wind that tasted faintly of alkali. No bell rang, no rider brought panic, yet the arithmetic had become plain enough that even the proud spoke in lowered voices when they said the word August. By sundown, talk on the church steps and store porch had narrowed to the same hard reckoning. How many days of draw remained? How much water stock might stand? Which families could spare a barrel and which could not? Heat had a way of stripping pride from conversation. Men who argued politics all winter now argued inches in a shaft and pounds in a bucket because figures had become more persuasive than hope. Hank Graham had ridden into that same town in June of the previous year with 2 trunks, 1 tool chest, and a silence that followed him like another piece of freight. He was not an old man, yet grief had settled into his posture with the weight of age, because outside Laramie his wife Eliza had died of childbed fever before dawn could break clean over the tents, and the infant had followed before evening, wrapped in a flour sack and buried where sagebrush held a little shade. Men who saw him arrive remembered the trunks first and the horse second, a bay gelding with a rubbed patch under the saddle. They remembered, too, that Hank did not ride the main street to look for company. He rode to the recorder, paid for ground no one wanted, and asked only where he could buy lime, nails, and wagon grease. The parcel lay on the lower edge of Cedar Bluff, 4 acres flood-scoured and discounted to $38, because spring runoff had bitten channels through the topsoil and because no reliable spring rose from that side of the grade. A land agent had listed it as suitable only for scrap and stubborn men. Hank bought it in cash and coin, then began as if the place had always been his intended ground. He raised a plain board house with a shed roof facing east, then put up a second structure of poles and plank where he stacked objects the town considered refuse: bent iron hoops from broken wagons, cracked stoveplates, axle pins with worn shoulders, lengths of chain, and cottonwood beams cut from deadfall along the river bend. He sorted by weight and by sound, not by appearance. Straight grain went under cover. Soft grain became kindling. Iron that rang clear stayed in one pile. Iron that thudded dull in another. His hands were calloused from old work and new necessity, and he handled each piece as though it still carried a future use. The knowledge behind that sorting had not come from books and had not come from a sudden revelation. It had come down through labor. Hank's father, Evan Graham, had been a millwright from Welsh mining country, a man who had crossed the ocean with chess plans for sluice gates and timber races folded beside family papers in oilcloth. Evan taught his son that water did not obey force for long, but it would serve steady design if a builder respected fall, weight, and timing more than pride. In Pennsylvania camps and Colorado cuts, father and son had measured drop with cord and plumstone, counted revolutions by watch, and learned to hear a failing bearing before it seized. A wheel is not wood, Evan used to say while planing a paddle edge in long, deliberate strokes. A wheel is agreement. Break agreement, and the river takes payment. Hank had carried that line beyond his father's grave, and after Eliza's death he carried it harder, because grief gave no order to a day unless a man made one. Cedar Bluff already had its order, and much of that order wore the face of Obadiah Kincaid. Kincaid owned the general store, held a council seat through influence if not title, and stood broad in tailored vests that buttoned over a prosperous middle earned by selling to every hunger and every winter alike. His beard was clipped close at the jaw. His boots were always polished, and he wore a watch chain heavy enough to signal wealth before he spoke. The store porch was his platform, the ledger his proof, and his judgments traveled faster than freight notices because families owed him for flour, lamp oil, and seed. When he laughed, others followed from habit or fear of debt. When he dismissed a notion, that notion often died in public before it met fair trial. He dismissed Hank early and repeatedly. At first he called the salvage piles a widower's grief work, harmless because it kept the man occupied. Then, as timber lengths multiplied and the shed filled with sorted iron, he called the effort a spectacle. If sorrow could pump water, he said one Sunday after service, loud enough for 3 wagon teams and a line of children to hear, we would all be irrigated by now. The remark drew sharp smiles, then easier laughter, then imitation. Men at the feed line repeated it, repeated. Women on church steps repeated a softened form. Schoolyard chatter turned the phrase into a rhyme with Hank's name. Mockery became a town habit, and habit took on the certainty of fact. Hank answered little of it. He paid for what he could, bartered where he could not, and worked to measurements scratched first in charcoal, then marked in all prick on seasoned boards. By the second week of July 1887, he had laid out a wheel circle 12 feet in diameter on packed earth behind the shed, using a center stake, a hemp line, and chalk slaked in vinegar to hold against dust. He selected wagon rim iron for 2 outer bands, heating and flattening warped sections over a trench forge until each piece matched a template within a 1/4 inch. Spokes he cut from seasoned cottonwood, then paired with braces from denser blackjack oak, bought second-hand off a retired freighter for $3.40. He bored mortises by hand auger at measured angles, pegged and strapped each joint, and set the axle housing from a salvaged threshing shaft returned on improvised blocks. The plan was not for a decorative wheel, and not for a private ornament. It was for an overshot system tied to a chain bucket lift that could raise river water 27 feet to a holding cistern above town grade, where gravity could do the remaining work. Costs came in small cuts that would have looked insignificant on one ledger line and crushing in aggregate. Square nails bought by the pound, lamp collar brass for journals, leather scraps for gasket faces, tallow, ash, rope, pitch, and 2 kegs of lime. Hank kept his own book in pencil columns. Date, item, amount, purpose. On July 19th, he paid $1.10 for chain links that should have cost half that sum. On July 23rd, he paid 75 cents for nails worth perhaps 30. The inflated prices came through Kincaid's counter with a mild expression and a stated logic. Risk, transport, inconvenience. Men overheard and shrugged. It was Kincaid's store. Kincaid set the terms. By early August, Hank had sunk a stone pier footing 3 feet below the established scour line near the narrow bend, laying field stone and lime in alternating lifts so floodwater would have less purchase on the base. He lined axle journals with hammered brass taken from broken lamp collars, polishing the interior surfaces with emery and oil until friction fell to a tolerable drag. Paddles went on at 18-inch intervals, each board beveled at the leading edge, so entry would bite water clean rather than slap. He set a pine stave pipe from intake trench to settling box, sealing seams with a paste of tallow and sifted ash, then wrapped the exterior in tarred cloth where sun would crack bare wood. Children watched from a distance, first for novelty, then because the wheel shape had begun to resemble its own argument. Older men watched too, arms crossed, faces unreadable. Obadiah Kincaid gave the project the name that would carry through Cedar Bluff long before the first full turn. He said it at the store porch in a tone meant for easy derision. Graham's junk wheel, he called it, and tapped his watch chain as if he had issued a legal ruling. The phrase spread with remarkable speed through feed lines, porch talk, and Sunday handshakes, because a nickname allows a town to avoid examining what it might owe. Hank heard it at the blacksmith, at the flower queue, once even from a boy too young to understand why the adults around him laughed. He set another pin, tightened another strap, and kept to his marks. To the bay gelding standing in shade beside the worksite, he said one evening while checking Plum against the last of the light, "Let them talk. Words do not draw water." The bay gelding flicked one ear towards him, then lowered its head again to the nosebag, and the last light of that July evening went copper along the rim iron stacked beside the shed. Hank checked the plumb line once more, wound it around its peg, and covered the journal housings with canvas against dust. Supper for him was beans gone thick in a blackened pot, and half a biscuit saved from morning, eaten on an upturned crate with his ledger open across his knee. He entered 2 lines by lantern, 1 pound square nails, 15 cents above fare, 1 used chain section, 3 cracked links removed, 40 cents. He closed the book, set the pencil under the strap, and listened to Cedar Bluff settle into uneasy dark. At the well, even after full dusk, ropes still rasped against the windlass because families were drawing late to avoid the worst heat. The sound carried like a warning. On July 3rd, 1888, before sunrise had cleared the eastern ridge, the thermometer nailed outside the blacksmith's door already stood at 82 degrees, and by noon it reached 102 in open shade. Heat came not as a sudden blow, but as a pressure that built hour upon hour, until boards in the storefronts gave off pitch and the horse trough rims burned skin. At the communal shaft, men tied wet rags around their palms and took their turns in silence. The buckets struck water deeper than the week before. Women leaned over the stone ring and listened for the splash, because the ear gave truer measure than the eye. Hank took his place, drew 1 bucket, tasted the grit in it, then stepped aside without argument when a mother with 2 small children moved forward. Stakes no longer needed explanation. Every soul in town understood that miscount and delay could cost lives before the month was done. He rode down to the river bend while the upper street still argued about ration intervals, dismounted and sat on his heels beside the intake trench to watch current speed against a marked stick. Water still moved, but midsummer push had weakened, the surface showing a tired glide where he expected muscle. He dropped a chip above the bend and counted under his breath to the stake at 20 feet. The transit time was longer by 3 breaths than the same test in early June. He wrote the count in the ledger margin. A wheel could work with slower flow, but not if built for ideal conditions and left no room for failure. His father had taught him that every design required a mercy margin for days when nature withheld cooperation. Evan Graham had taught with tools in hand and little patience for vague instruction. In western Pennsylvania, where coal cuts and mill races crossed the same muddy valleys, he made his son measure each claim 3 ways and defend the numbers aloud. He would ask where strain would travel when a pin failed, where torque would gather when wet wood swelled, and which component must be made easy to replace in darkness. Wrong answers meant dismantling and doing again. Correct answers brought no praise, only the next question. By the time Hank was 16, he could hear misalignment in half a turn and could file brass to tolerances that kept friction from stealing power at the axle. Years later, after Evan died of a winter lung fever, men who had argued with him still admitted he had been right about nearly every wheel that lasted. Eliza had understood that craft before she understood its language. She had met Hank in a rail camp kitchen near Cheyenne when he was rebuilding a grain elevator lift, and she was sewing mended coats for freighters at 15 cents a seam. Marriage gave them little comfort in property and much comfort in labor, shared without complaint. She kept his books when work was steady, learned to read his sketches, and once told a boarding house table that men who mocked measurements had never buried money in broken machinery. Her death outside Laramie did not make him a saint, and did not make him hard. It left him with an unfinished conversation and a need to put exact work between himself and ruin. In Cedar Bluff, that need became preparation. By mid-morning, he had set 3 boys to hauling river cobble in a borrowed mule cart and paid them in meal credit through the butcher at 10 cents each for the half day. He selected stone by face and grain, rejecting pieces with hairline seams that would split under repeated wetting. At the existing footing, he laid a reinforcing outer course and repointed the previous day's joints where lime had dried too fast in the heat. Mortar mix ran 1 part quicklime to 3 parts, sifted sand with river water, added slowly until the trowel drag held a low ridge. Too wet, and the bond would weaken. Too dry, and voids would remain. He taught the boys to watch the edges for proper squeeze-out, and to tamp with wood, never iron, so the stones seated without fracture. Near noon, Obadiah Kincaid arrived in a light wagon with a striped awning and 2 store clerks riding behind him to fetch a crate from an upriver claim. He drew up where Hank could see his polished boot, but not so close that dust from the work would touch his cuffs. His expression was cordial in the manner of a man certain of audience. "Graham," he said, loud enough for the boys and the teamster to hear, "you have built a monument to stubbornness on land worth less than your scrap. If you wish to throw labor into the river, kindly do not ask honest merchants to finance the spectacle." He tipped his hat toward the half-framed wheel. "Junk wheel work, all of it. When sensible men buy a modern pump, this town will forget your toy." Hank stood, wiped mortar from his forearm with a rag, and answered at ordinary volume, "I have asked no gift, only fair weight for coin." Kincaid smiled without warmth, tapped the sideboard of his wagon, and said that transport, risk, and scarcity all had their price. Then he drove on. The clerks looked back once, their faces uncertain, but they followed their employer up the grade. The boys resumed tamping. The river kept moving. Public derision had become routine enough that even children no longer flinched at it. By the 2nd week of July, Hank shifted from footing rework into drive assembly upgrades on the wheel frame he had raised the previous summer, and his work took on the rhythm of a machine shop set outdoors. He trued the salvaged shaft on improvised wooden V-blocks, rotating and filing high spots until runout fell within a narrow wobble he judged acceptable for frontier service. Brass journal liners cut from lamp collars bought by the pound were annealed, hammered to curve, and polished with oil and pumice. He remounted paddles at measured spacing, 18 inches center to center, replacing warped pieces and using bolts he had recut with clean threads. Bucket chain links were sorted by wear, weakest, discarded, middle grade assigned to lower run, strongest links reserved for the lift segment nearest the crest where load and shock would peak. Cost entries filled the ledger in tight lines. $2.80 for lime and sand hauled, $1.25 for tar cloth, 60 cents for tallow, $4.10 for oak pins and braces. The total climbed towards $64.20, each expense tested against utility. A family from the South Edge claim came by in the late afternoon with 2 empty kegs and a quiet request. Would Hank trade labor for 1 extra draw from his barrel reserve if the town ration tightened again? He said yes, with terms recorded in plain words. The father would plain stave stock 2 evenings a week. The eldest daughter would stitch screencloth for the intake. Hank would provide one measured bucket per day beyond their allotment until rain returned or rail water arrived. No one spoke of charity. On that ground, transactions were dignity made practical. As July gave way to August, warning signs multiplied in forms familiar to stockmen and dismissed by men who trusted ledgers more than land. Geese cut south in restless lines nearly 3 weeks early. Grasshoppers clustered in dry ditch bottoms rather than creek edges. The river's eddies at the narrow bend no longer curled tight around submerged rock, flattening into weak spirals that meant diminished force. 2 outlying pasture wells failed outright by August 19th, and teamsters began carrying extra barrels even for short runs between claims. Council minutes still used the phrase normal late rains, but the phrase had begun to sound like an article of faith rather than an assessment. On August 28th, clouds built from the west by mid-afternoon and gave Cedar Bluff a brief storm that smelled of relief before it touched earth. Rain struck hard for 15 minutes, then thinned to scattered drops, less than a quarter inch in total by the church gauge. Children ran into the street laughing. Men on the store porch removed their hats and called it deliverance. Kincaid came out with his sleeves rolled and declared that panic had been expensive foolishness. By nightfall, mud had already crusted. At dawn, the well showed a temporary rise of 18 inches. By the next evening, the level had dropped below its previous mark. Hank did not attend the porch celebration and did not argue with those who did. He rode to the wheel frame in first light, chalked new marks on the cistern staves for ration intervals, and rechecked the channel gate with a carpenter's square and a steel rule worn smooth from years of use. If flow weakened further, the overshot feed alone might falter in dead stretches, so he laid out a hand-crank bypass on a sideshaft, 4-foot lever radius, removable handles, 2 operators per shift, geared to keep bucket rise steady when current lagged. He measured, cut, bored, and fitted until twilight erased his lines. Nettie Alvarez, 12 years old and quick with a hammer, came down from her father's forge carrying a wrapped bundle of rivets and a small tin of oil. She stopped at the edge of the work site where townsfolk usually stopped to watch without crossing in, then stepped over the chalk line as if crossing a border that had already cost too much. "My father says these are sound iron," she told him, setting the bundle on the bench. "He says I may stay if there is work that matters." Hank handed her the center punch and pointed to the bracket plate clamped under lantern light. "Mark on these intervals," he said, indicating each line with the awl tip. "No guesswork. We hold to measure." She marked, he drilled, and the first pieces of the bypass came together while Cedar Bluff still spoke of rain as if it had solved anything at all. She marked, he drilled, and the first pieces of the bypass came together while Cedar Bluff still spoke of rain as if it had solved anything at all. Hank kept the bracket plate clamped to a white oak bench he had trued with a hand plane, and Nettie held the lantern high while he reamed each hole to match the rivet shank with almost no play. A loose fit would chatter under load, and chatter would become fracture in less than a week of continuous operation. He explained that to her without drama, as one might explain the need to close a gate before night wind. "Metal fails from insult repeated," he said, "not from one loud blow." She nodded and checked each rivet by passing it through both plates before he set it, laying the accepted pieces in rows of 10 on a folded burlap sack. By dawn the next day, the side shaft sat in place on temporary cribbing, a 12-foot length of seasoned timber wrapped at both bearing points with iron strap reheated and shrunk to bite the grain. Hank had cut the gear teeth from laminated hardwood blanks, then faced each tooth with thin iron tabs so wet grit would not eat the edges in a single week. The hand crank arms, each 4 feet from center to grip, were offset by a half turn to keep the operators from striking wrists when urgency made them careless. Nettie worked the pump drill while he pinned the collar. Her father, Thomas Alvarez, arrived before breakfast with a small hammer and no ceremony, checked the rivet heads in 3 brisk taps and said only, "These will hold if the collar keeps oil." Hank pointed to the tin Nettie had brought. Thomas left it beside the journal and returned to his forge. On August 30th, with noon heat at 99 degrees and no cloud rising from the west, Hank moved from assembly into throughput testing. He had already doubled the bucket count on the chain, increasing from 26 to 52 cups, cut and folded from stoveplate and reinforced at the lip with hoop iron. More buckets increased lift per turn, but also increased drag. Therefore, he trimmed bucket depth by a finger width and set vent holes near the heel so each cup would clear the upper sprocket without carrying dead weight back down the run. He and Nettie walked the line from intake to crest with a grease pencil, marking every point where friction or spill stole useful volume. At the settling box, he fitted a removable screen frame stitched with wire mesh from discarded flour sifters, then installed a second coarse screen at the channel mouth to catch sticks before they reached the paddles. Every added step cost minutes in maintenance and saved hours in repair. His ledger for that day carried 13 entries, each one small and necessary. 2 feet of scrap brass, 18 cents. 1 pound tallow, 12 cents. 6 carriage bolts reused and retapped, no cash. Mule hire for hauling cistern planks, 50 cents. 1 redwood stave replaced where checking had opened a seam, 70 cents. The running total moved above $64.20, then above 66, then above 67, and he recorded each rise without complaint because numbers were part of accountability, not grievance. The cistern itself, braced on a timber platform above town grade, now held enough for ration distribution if run continuously, and he struck chalk intervals down the inner wall with measured spacing tied to household counts. 1 mark represented 10 gallons. 2 marks represented 20. He wrote the same figures on an exterior board where any soul could read them. By the first day of September, the worksite had taken on the look of a modest municipal yard rather than one man's project. 2 widowers from the South Edge claim came at dawn to plane replacement paddles in exchange for future draw rights. A grandmother from the upper lane arrived with a basket of patched screencloth and sat under the shed awning, tying edge seams where wire had frayed. Nettie kept a slate of tasks: clear intake, oil journals, check chain pins, scrape silt from settling box, inspect bucket lips for cracks. Hank added 1 line at the bottom in heavier chalk: no private allotments. Measure by household count. The rule was not a moral flourish. It was the only way to keep peace when scarcity sharpened every conversation. Yet as the structure gained utility, the ridicule did not fade. It changed form and sharpened into exclusion. At Kincaid's store, where barrels once stood in loose rows and laughter rose easy on ordinary evenings, price boards now hung behind the counter in firm black digits that climbed every 3rd day. 5 cents a bucket became 10, then 15 by mid-July. And when laborers protested that wages had not moved, Kincaid spoke of transport risk and market discipline with the tone of a sermon. He began to refer to Hank in the 3rd person while Hank stood within earshot, a practiced discourtesy that invited others to follow. "The river mechanic has a theater downstream," he told a line of customers one afternoon, smoothing his vest while dust collected at the sill. "If citizens prefer spectacle to proper procurement, they may queue there when the toy breaks." Those who repeated him did not always intend cruelty, but repetition turned borrowed language into local doctrine. Schoolboys at the hitch rail tapped spokes with sticks and chanted junk wheel in rhythm until a teacher called them in. 2 teamsters refused to lend a hoist for lifting the upper trough braces, then rented the same hoist to Kincaid for moving private barrels into his locked back room. At a barn raising on the north slope, Hank arrived with a broad axe and a coil of sound rope. The foreman accepted the rope and told him there was no place on the crew that day. Hank left the rope and walked back to the river. No protest followed him. Silence can isolate as effectively as insult. On the evening of September 1st, the council held an open meeting in the church hall to address ration enforcement. Heat lingered in the plank walls long after sunset, and every bench was filled. Hank attended at the rear with his hat in his hands, not to ask favor but to submit a written proposal for two measures: temporary communal labor on the intake channel and reimbursement for shared materials if the wheel were used for town distribution. He gave the paper to the clerk. Kincaid rose before the clerk could read it aloud and called the request opportunism wrapped in engineering language. "Public money," he said, "shall not be wagered on Graham's junk wheel while proper suppliers still function." Several heads nodded, some from conviction and some from debt. The clerk recorded that the motion was tabled pending improved weather and confirmed rail shipment. The room dispersed in relief at postponement, which often resembles decision when fear is near. Hank did not speak during the argument and did not speak when a ranch hand muttered that widowers should keep to private sorrows. He waited for the benches to clear, took back his folded copy from the clerk, and asked only whether the council would at least post household counts so fair rationing could be calculated if conditions worsened. The clerk said perhaps next week. Nettie, who had come with a bundle of rags for lamp wicks, watched the exchange from the doorway, and then walked with Hank down the grade carrying the folded paper under her arm. At the worksite, he reopened the ledger and added a note in the margin: "Council declined labor support. Prepare for independent operation." During those same days, the land itself kept offering signals to anyone willing to read them without pride. Cattle on the East Flats began bawling before dawn and drifted toward shaded cuts 2 hours earlier than usual, conserving movement as if August had become July. Cottonwoods along the river shed leaves while still green at the stem, a stress response old farmers recognized from drought years. The geese had already gone early. Now even the magpies clustered near troughs and pecked at damp seams between stones where no feed lay. Hank measured river transit against his 20-foot stake each morning and evening. The count lengthened by increments too small to alarm casual eyes and too consistent to ignore. On 31st August, it took 11 breaths to pass the mark. On September 1st, it took 12. On September 2nd, with dawn wind from the south and powder dust lifting off wagon tracks, it took 14. He brought those numbers to Thomas Alvarez while Nettie filed burrs from a chain pin. Thomas listened, then lifted a blacksmith's straight edge over the pin and said he had never seen the town so near mechanical failure in water, and still so certain someone else would solve it. He sent Nettie to the upper lane with a message to 3 households that had quietly agreed to trade labor for draw. Bring barrels now, not tomorrow. She returned with 2 women and an older boy, each pushing a handcart with empty kegs. Hank showed them the chalk marks and the waiting order. No one spoke loudly. Scarcity had taught quiet. By the second evening of September, the communal well rope no longer rasped in steady rhythm, but in irregular bursts, because every draw required longer pauses for seepage. Those pauses generated rumor. One man swore he had seen moisture dark at the shaft wall and called it recovery. Another said he heard a fuller splash before dawn and declared that upriver rains must be coming. Kincaid repeated those claims from his porch with careful optimism, telling customers that temporary hardship rewarded patience and orderly purchase. He still sold private buckets at a premium from barrels in his storeroom, and he still declined to post his reserves. Families who had once bought flour on credit now paid cash for water and took less flour home. Hank read different evidence. The bucket bottoms from the town well came up with suspended grit that settled in thick layers within minutes. indicating sidewall disturbance rather than healthy rise. When he poured one sample into a clear jar and let it stand on the bench, the water separated into bands, clouded top, gray center, and a silt bed deep enough to coat a thumbnail. At the river intake, he found minnows stranded in a side pocket that had connected through midsummer in ordinary years, and he adjusted the gate angle by a quarter turn to preserve head against further drop. He instructed Nettie to keep 2 lanterns filled at all times, one at the upper trough and one at the forge corner, and to stack pre-cut pin stock beside the anvil where it could be reached in darkness. That night, while the town settled into the brittle calm that comes when options narrow, Hank ran a dry drill for emergency operation. He assigned positions as if a full queue already stood above him. Thomas at the crank when flow lagged, Nettie at the markboard and household tally, the widowers at intake clearing, the grandmother at screen rinse and relash. They practiced hand signals for stop, slow, clear obstruction, and switch crew. He timed each exchange with a pocket watch whose crystal was chipped at the edge. First cycle, too slow. Second cycle, acceptable. Third cycle, smooth enough to trust. When the chain passed over the crest sprocket in steady motion and each empty bucket kissed the return rail without collision, he nodded once and ended the drill. Near midnight, a wind came down from the uplands carrying no coolness, only dust, fine as flour, that settled on the lantern glass and dulled the flame. Up in town, the well queue had not dispersed. Down by the river, the wheel waited on its chocks, paddles still, chain hung ready, tools laid in exact order on the bench. At first light, Cedar Bluff would test whether confidence could draw water from a shaft already failing, or whether measured labor on a mocked frame of iron and dead timber would have to carry a town that had laughed too long. At first light on September the 3rd, 1888, the communal rope came up dry twice in succession, and by the third attempt the bucket struck bottom silt with a hollow scrape that carried across the stone ring, like iron on bone. The thermometer outside Alvarez Forge read 89 degrees before sunrise, climbing with pitiless steadiness until noon reached 104 in the narrow strip of church shade where families stood with kegs and prayer books in the same hands. Cedar Bluff had lived on one shaft and one assumption, and both failed within the same morning. Men lowered lamps to check the lining and drew them back, coated in wet gray grit. A seam had opened in the casing below 30 feet, likely where heat and repeated strain had shifted old timbers out of true, and seepage now carried fines into what little remained. Each haul muddied further. By 10 o'clock, no bucket drew clear enough to drink without settling in cloth. By noon, no bucket drew at all. Order broke first in small ways. Queue lines bent into argument. Households that had counted 3 draws found only one. 2 ranch hands tried to lower a private barrel on a rope splice and jammed the windlass. Deputy Thomas Blevins cleared the platform, reset turns by family size, and stood in full sun with his hat off so all could see his face while he announced the limits. He had kept peace at branding disputes and freight claims for 8 years, yet drought made every ruling personal. By early afternoon, his shirt darkened to the waist, salt rimed his collar, and his voice grew hoarse from repeating the same sentence. 1 vessel per household until further notice, no exceptions, return at sunset. The sentence lost meaning because there was nothing left to draw. Kincaid's store became the second line of desperation, then the first. Obadiah Kincaid had stacked private barrels for weeks behind locked planks, confident that scarcity could be managed like inventory. But panic consumed inventory faster than any ledger model. He raised the board again by noon, painting 20 cents a bucket in hard strokes that dripped down the grain, then 25 by mid-afternoon when laborers still paid. His clerks stripped shelves of tin cups, canvas sacks, and cracked crockery to use as vessels, and by 3 o'clock the storefront that once signaled abundance looked gnawed to studs. Flour bins sat open and light. Salt pork hooks hung bare. A child reached for a dipper and found only nails in a tray. Kincaid tried to impose numbered tickets at the counter, then abandoned the attempt when souls surged both doors at once. 2 panes broke. One barrel stave split under crowd pressure and spilled 3 gallons across the floorboards, where hands dropped to mop with aprons and wring water into cups. Wealth had given Kincaid authority in ordinary months. Heat stripped it to fear. Downriver, Hank had begun turning the wheel at dawn for test load and held output in reserve, while Nettie marked household tallies on slate, expecting council notice that never came. By early afternoon, runners arrived from the upper lane with conflicting claims, each certain, each urgent, none authorized. He sent them back with the same answer: post counts, form line, bring vessels clean, and clear the intake path of drift if they wanted volume by evening. The instructions sounded severe to men unused to being instructed by him. Yet machine work had no use for offended pride. He kept the gate half set to preserve head while river flow held, and when current flattened near the bend, Tomas Alvarez and one widower took the crank arms to maintain lift. Bucket chain rose, tipped, and returned in measured rhythm. The upper trough began to sing with flow. By late afternoon, the false calm that sometimes follows civic denial collapsed entirely. The council bell rang twice and then ceased because no one wished to call a meeting while children cried in line. Dust moved through Cedar Bluff in low sheets, entering shutter cracks, settling on tongues, turning every swallow harsh. Livestock bawled at empty troughs. Mothers watered infants with spoonfuls that did not wet the cloth beneath their chins. Men who had mocked Hank's chalkboard now studied it from a distance, trying to understand marks that had been visible for weeks and urgent only now. The wheel did not solve the day in a single turn. It offered structure where panic had replaced policy. 3 days of compromised water had already weakened the settlement, and on that 3rd day the human cost became permanent. Clara Bell, the town midwife, had spent the morning moving between cabins with a satchel of cloths and willow bark, refusing her own ration to carry a final bucket to a fevered neighbor on the north rise. She reached the doorstep, set the bucket down without spilling, and sat beside it to recover. She did not rise again. Women from both lanes bore her body under a quilt she had sewn for another household in winter, and they placed her hands over each other as if she were resting between calls. She had delivered more than half the town's children. In death, she carried the same austerity she lived by, choosing service when her own strength had narrowed to almost nothing. Deputy Blevins remained at the dry well long after duty had become symbolic, trying to keep men from fighting over a rope that reached only mud. Near sunset, he stepped down from the stone ring, took 2 paces toward the shade wall, and collapsed before anyone caught him. They moved him inside the church where air still held heat from noon. Thomas Alvarez and Pastor Reuben Hale loosened his collar, cooled his wrists, and spoke his name with increasing urgency. He did not respond. By evening prayer, his badge lay on the Bible table beside a tin cup half full of water no one had persuaded him to drink while others waited in line. The town had relied on his fairness in smaller conflicts. Drought gave him a conflict no law could settle. The 3rd loss came at night and struck differently because it was a child, and because everyone could trace the path that led to it. Jonah Pike, 8 years old, had taken contaminated sips from an alkali seep beyond the East Flats after his family's ration failed, and for 3 days his mother had tried to cool him with damp cloth and whispered hymns while his father rode for medicine that did not exist in stock. Before dawn on September 4th, word spread from the Pike cabin that Jonah had failed in the night despite every watch kept at his bedside. The doctor from Granite Falls had not arrived. The rail water had not arrived. The well had not returned. At first light, the Pikes wrapped him in his school blanket, blue with a stitched border Clara Belle had mended the previous spring. The entire lane saw the small bundle pass and said nothing. 4 days after the council had tabled Hank's proposal, souls who had dismissed measured preparation now moved through streets with empty vessels and no argument left. Pride does not vanish at once. It erodes under repetition of need. Kincaid, whose porch had been a tribunal for a year of ridicule, stood inside his own store staring at shelves reduced to paper labels and splintered crate bottoms. His 2 clerks had gone to fetch water and not returned yet. The back room, once guarded, held fewer barrels than rumor claimed, and none enough to carry the town another day. He sent a boy to the river to ask about purchase priority, then sent him back before he reached the lane, as if to retract the request and the humility it implied. He sent him again at dusk when it became clear that withholding need would not conjure water from wood. Dusk came copper and cruel, with the air still above 96 degrees and no relief in the west. Nettie left the tally board to Thomas, ran uphill to the well square, and found not debate but vacancy around the stone ring, as if failure itself had emptied the place. She crossed to Kincaid's porch, where men who once laughed in chorus now watched the road downgrade and waited for someone else to move first. No one did. She turned and ran back to Hank, dust to her knees, braid loose, voice stripped of all ceremony. "The well gives nothing," she said. "If we do not open now, we bury more by morning." Hank did not answer with reproach, and did not ask who had mocked him loudest. He reached for the gate lever, nodded once to Thomas, and called positions as he had in the night drill. Intake clear, upper trough ready, tally slate open, 2 at crank, 1 at screen. The crew moved. The chocks came free. Water struck the first paddles with a heavy slap, then steadied into force as the wheel found agreement with current and load. Chain buckets climbed in glittering rows, tipped into the trough and returned for more. At the cistern platform, Hank set the first household mark himself, then stepped aside so Nettie could read names and counts in a voice that held despite exhaustion. 1 vessel per household, then to the end of line, then repeat as volume allowed. No private sales, no special rank, no exception for cash. Night operations revealed every weakness at once. Dust coated the journal housings faster than expected, requiring oil every 20 minutes. Driftwood lodged at the course screen twice in 1 hour. A bucket lip cracked and had to be swapped from reserve. Then, near midnight, an axle pin sheared at the upper sprocket with a report like a gunshot, and the chain lurched to a stop while 20 souls stood with vessels and no reserve left at home. Thomas shouted for lanterns. Nettie held the line from breaking by reading names louder, not faster. Hank pulled the failed pin, measured the break face by touch, and ran to the forge corner where pre-cut spring steel from a wagon leaf lay ready, because he had expected this exact insult repeated under load. He heated, hammered, and quenched by practiced intervals, turning the steel in tongs until color reached proper cherry, drawing it back short of brittle, then dressing the shoulders with 3 fast file passes so the fit would seat without wobble. 48 minutes after failure, he drove the replacement through collar and shaft, peened both ends, and ordered slow turn by hand before full load. The chain caught, climbed, and held. A murmur moved through the line, not triumph, only relief sharp enough to sting. The wheel turned through the rest of the night while shifts changed at the crank and intake. By first light on September 4th, the cistern marks showed controlled draw by household count, and Cedar Bluff, battered and ashamed and still thirsty, remained alive because a mocked frame of scrap iron and dead timber had been built to endure exactly this hour. Hank left Nettie at the tally board with a carpenter pencil tied to string, checked the upper trough for hairline leaks, and then moved down to the intake where silt had begun to bank against the coarse screen in a crescent that would have flow before noon if it were not cleared by hand. Tomas Alvarez and the two widowers worked with forked poles in waist-deep current, levering sticks free while Hank reset the gate by quarter turns and listened for the wheel's cadence. When the rhythm stayed even, he returned uphill and began assigning shifts not by status but by stamina. 40 minutes at crank, 20 on screens, 20 carrying filled vessels to elders who could not stand in line. That morning, he opened his own shed and board house as auxiliary stations. The shed became a maintenance bay with tools laid on numbered pegs. The house, plain and close, became a cooling room where cloths were soaked and laid across necks while the next draw cycle ran. He gave up his mattress to Clarabelle's sister, who had not slept since the burial preparation began, and moved his ledger, his wife's folded shawl, and his tool rolls to a crate beneath the eaves, so there would be floor space for children and elders through the heat peak. One kettle held boiled river water for washing cuts and eyes. Another held willow bark tea for headaches and fever. Nothing in that arrangement resembled heroics. It resembled competent triage. By September 6th, 3 days into emergency operation, the town had learned that water distribution was not a single machine, but a chain of plain disciplines. Scrub vessel rims before filling. Keep shade cloth over stored buckets. Never dip unwashed cups into communal barrels. Report cracked staves at once, and write each household draw where all could verify it. Nettie enforced the board with a steadiness that made older men lower their voices when they challenged counts. Hank taught her to read the cistern by sound as well as mark, tapping the staves with 2 knuckles and listening for the hollow shift that signaled dangerous drawdown. He taught 6 boys to grease journals without fouling pads, and he taught 2 grandmothers to lash emergency screen cloth so tightly that drift could not peel it loose in night wind. The contrast with Cedar Bluff's expensive confidence grew harsher each day. Kincaid had paid $112 over 2 seasons into a speculative order for a cast-iron pump assembly promised from the East, then delayed by freight disputes and never delivered before the crisis. He had bought polished barrel racks and imported brass spigots for display, while neglecting to invest in intake labor, shared storage, or maintenance training. Hank's total outlay, as recorded in his book through September 7th, stood at $71.05, including replacement steel, tar cloth, lime, and mule hire. What endured was not elegance. It was preparedness under constraint. On September 8th, when afternoon heat still reached 98 degrees, Obadiah Kincaid came to the platform alone carrying a folded deed abstract and a canvas purse. He waited until the line thinned, then set both on the cistern rail where Hank could see them. "Priority barrels," he said, voice rough from dust and nights without rest. "Cash now, land later, for my household and my clerks." Hank looked at the purse, then at the chalkboard, then at Kincaid's face, stripped of porch authority and lined with fear. "1 vessel per household," he answered. "Your count is the same as any other count." Kincaid stood still for several breaths, took back the purse, and left the abstract where it lay. Hank handed the document to Nettie, who wrote on its reverse in careful block letters, "Received during emergency. No special allotment granted." She filed it under a stone with the daily tally sheets. 6 days passed before the rail relief train finally reached Cedar Bluff from Pueblo. Its arrival announced first by whistle, then by the slow rattle of water wagons up the grade on September 14th. By then, the wheel had run in shifts for 11 full days, with only 2 stoppages longer than 10 minutes. The relief barrels were welcomed without ceremony, rolled immediately to temporary racks, and integrated into Hank's ration schedule so the town would not lurch from scarcity into waste. He insisted the outside shipment be logged against household counts, just as River Draw had been logged. Scarcity had taught one lesson. Procedure had to keep it. Funerals for Clara Bell, Deputy Blevins, and Jonah Pike were held at sundown over 2 evenings to spare elders the noon heat. No one spoke at length. Names and deeds were enough. Clara's sewing basket stood by her coffin, lid tied with twine. Blevins's badge hung from a black ribbon on the church lectern. Jonah's blue school blanket, washed and mended, lay folded at the foot of the pew where his family sat. Hank attended each service and stood at the rear, hat in both hands, then returned to the intake before dawn the next day, because mourning and maintenance had to proceed together. The reckoning did not arrive as one dramatic gathering. It arrived as a sequence of acts that could not be mistaken. Families who had refused tools brought them back sharpened. The teamsters who had denied the hoist delivered it unasked and stayed to reset the flume braces. The schoolteacher who had laughed at the nickname crossed out junk wheel from a copybook exercise and replaced it with river lift assembly, then brought her older pupils to learn the maintenance list on Saturdays. Pastor Hale read the household draw ledger from the pulpit, not as praise but as civic record, and asked every family to hear its own name beside every other without exception. Shame moved through the town quietly, like cold through wet boots. Kincaid's reckoning came last and in public because his mockery had been public. On the 18th of September, with the temperature finally fallen to 76 by afternoon and a weak cloud cover from the west, he asked the council clerk to call a meeting at the cistern platform rather than the church hall. 212 souls attended by count, standing among barrels, tools, and chalkboards still marked from emergency days. Kincaid wore the same vest he had worn on his porch in July, but it hung loose now, and dust had settled into seams no brush could hide. He spoke without notes. "I called this work junk because I mistook polish for wisdom," he said, carrying his voice to the last row. "I sold fear by the bucket while this man built capacity by the inch. I charged more when need was greatest. I spoke with contempt where I should have listened with care. 3 of our own are buried. We cannot price that loss, and we cannot unmake what was said on my porch. I was wrong in judgment, wrong in speech, and wrong in conduct as a merchant entrusted with common welfare." No one applauded. No one interrupted. He turned toward Hank and continued, "Lower now. I ask what restitution is fit, if any can be fit." Hank stepped forward with the ledger under his arm, the failed axle pin in one hand, and the alkali sample jar in the other, each object a record of what Cedar Bluff had ignored until pain made it legible. He placed all 3 on the cistern rail before he answered. "Forgiveness without new practice is only sound," he said. "I did not build this for revenge, and I will not use your shame for profit. If you want restitution, make structure from it." He then set out terms in measured sequence, as he would lay out a repair. 2 communal cisterns above grade, funded by ordinance within 30 days. A permanent intake crew rotated by household and season. Published ration protocols for drought months. Annual training days for all youths, 12 and older. And price ceilings on emergency water sales enforceable by council fine. He added one final condition. These records go to town custody, not mine. Knowledge kept private fails the first time one man is absent. The council voted that evening 19-2 to adopt every measure and to appoint Hank unpaid superintendent for the first year with authority over maintenance standards. He accepted the duty and declined any title beyond caretaker. Kincaid offered a second time to transfer discounted land in settlement. Hank declined that as well and directed him instead to supply nails, lime, and chain at cost for all communal waterworks until the debt of conduct had been worked down in service. Kincaid agreed, and for once no one mistook the agreement for generosity. It was obligation properly named. By October, crews had sunk foundations for a second cistern near the North Lane. By December, Winterized covers were in place over both tanks, and intake tools hung in locked racks with duplicate keys, held by 4 households rather than 1 merchant. In spring 1889, the first annual training day assembled 93 youths and 40 adults at the river bend, where Nettie Alvarez, now official tally keeper, taught Mark reading with the same clip precision Hank had taught her under lantern light. She kept the old chalkboard, planed smooth and repainted, as a teaching slate. Years later, figures told their own moral. Cedar Bluff counted 349 souls in 1902. Every new build permit required stored water planning and writing, barrel capacity, roof catchment, and emergency share protocol. The phrase, "build it like Graham's wheel," entered local speech not as a taunt, but as a standard for work meant to outlast weather and vanity. Kincaid's store survived, smaller and quieter, with emergency price limits posted year-round beside flour rates. He never removed them. The timber and iron frame at the bend still turns each summer. The journals are replaced on schedule. The paddles are measured, not guessed. Children who never knew Clara Bell by sight still learn her name on training day, along with Blevins and Jonah Pike, because procedure without memory decays into routine, and routine without memory invites repetition of harm. On the cistern platform, carved into a redwood plank sealed against sun and frost, an inscription remains in plain words Hank approved and then refused to embellish. Respect fall, weight, and timing more than pride. The river keeps no ledger, but towns must. In Cedar Bluff they do. On the first Saturday of June 1903, before sunup had burned the chill from the riverstones, the training bell sounded 3 measured strikes and families came down the grade carrying clean buckets, ledger slates, and children old enough to lift a crank handle without stumbling. Hank stood by the intake gate with silver in his beard and the same steady hands, while Nettie Alvarez, appointed tally keeper by council vote, chalked household counts on a board planed from the old emergency slate. Thomas checked journal oil with 2 fingers and a nod. The drill began as Hank had run it during the worst week. Clear intake, set course screen, open gate by quarter turns, verify crest alignment, then call for slow rotation until chain tension settled. He did not lecture first. He required motion first, then explanation after each action held. When a boy set a bucket lip backward on the return run, Hank stopped the line and made him remove and refit it, while 20 souls watched in patient silence. "A small error repeated becomes town trouble," he said. The boy reset the lip true. The wheel resumed. The trough filled. By mid-morning, the old contrast stood visible without anyone naming it. The river lift, built from dead timber and scrap iron bought a little at a time, ran smooth enough to feed both cisterns while 3 teams practiced maintenance. Up the hill, the cast iron pump assembly Kincaid had once ordered at great cost, finally delivered years late and never suited to Cedar Bluff's silt load, sat in the yard behind the store with 1 cracked housing and 2 seized valves, preserved as a caution rather than a tool. Children touched both machines on training day. They learned which one had carried them. 3 days after that drill, on June 10th, the council met at dusk on the cistern platform to settle ceremonial custody of the remaining personal originals and duplicate crisis records that still sat in boxes beneath Hank's eaves, while official town custody had already been established under post-crisis governance. He brought them himself in a handcart, his penciled ledger wrapped in oilcloth, the sheared axle pin mounted on a cedar block, the alkali sample jar sealed with wax and labeled in Nettie's careful hand, and a packet of tally sheets tied with twine, browned by sun. Nettie placed each item on the rail and read the labels aloud. No one hurried her. Obadiah Kincaid asked to speak after the clerk completed inventory. He had grown lean, his watch chain replaced by plain cord, and he kept his hat in both hands through the full address. There were men who saw and stayed silent, he said, turning not only to Hank but to the crowd. My clerks looked back from the wagon in 1888 and knew he was building what we would need. They told me that night. I told them to keep store hours and leave river work to fools. Their silence was learned from mine. One of those former clerks, Ezra Pike, Jonah's uncle, stepped forward and confirmed it in a low voice, then asked that his statement be entered in council, minutes beside Kincaid's. The clerk wrote every word. A week later, when cottonwoods along the bend began to shed a few leaves early in the heat, Hank used the sign as lesson, not omen. He gathered the older children at the waterline and pointed out the flattened eddy behind the basalt outcrop, then the geese cutting south in a line too soon for comfort, then magpies clustered near damp seams between stones. These were all present before the well failed, he said. The land reported. We refused to read. He made each child repeat the list and mark it in a pocket notebook distributed by the schoolteacher who had once mocked his work. She no longer missed the training days. On July 2nd, 1904, 16 years to the day after the heat run that began the collapse, Cedar Bluff held a public reckoning service not at church, but at the lower yard, among tools and working timber where pride had first done its damage. Pastor Hale read the names Clara Bell, Thomas Blevins, and Jonah Pike before any other business, and then stepped aside for household testimonies. They were not theatrical confessions. They were plain records spoken by souls who had learned to distrust grand language. A ranch widow admitted she had repeated the nickname to feel safe among wealthier neighbors. A teamster admitted he denied Hank the hoist because Kincaid carried his debt note. Thomas admitted he had waited too long to cross openly from private agreement to public support because he feared losing forge accounts. Kincaid spoke last among the elders and did not ask for pardon. He announced that the deed abstract he once laid on the rail for Priority Water had been converted, registered, and transferred in full to Town Trust as the permanent maintenance yard for both communal cisterns, with no reversion clause and no rent. The clerk held up the stamped paper for all to see. The same abstract Nettie had marked during the emergency now bore county seals and the signatures of every councilman, including Kincaid's. A murmur moved through the crowd, not admiration, but assent that obligation had been made material at last. Hank answered only after the papers were placed in the lockbox, and the lockbox key was copied to 4 households, as he had required from the beginning. He stood by the wheel, one palm on a paddle edge smoothed by years of use, and spoke in the same measured cadence he used for instruction. "You ask what to do with shame," he said. "Do not polish it into a story that flatters us. Bind it to procedure. Teach children to read a river before they need a river. Post prices before fear arrives. Share records before one man grows tired or proud. I will not call that forgiveness because forgiveness is private, and this duty is public. I will call it maintenance of life." No one applauded until he stepped back. By the second week of August 1906, Hank turned day-to-day operation over to Nettie by formal vote and written handoff. The scene took place in full daylight at the intake gate, with tools laid out for witness, grease tin, wrench set, pin stock, screen hooks, chalk line, and the old pocket watch with chipped crystal. He named each item, its use, and its replacement interval, and Nettie repeated each instruction before taking custody. Then he handed her the watch, not as ornament but as timing authority for shift changes. "Count by work, not by argument," he said. She nodded once and set the watch in her apron pocket. On January the 14th, 1911, after a hard freeze that left white rime on the cistern rails, Hank died in his sleep in the same plain board house he had raised on discounted ground for $38. He was buried above the river bend at noon with the wheel stopped only long enough for the service and then restarted by Nettie before dusk because winter households still needed draw. At his request, there was no carved praise on his marker, only name, dates, and the words Millwright's son. Eliza's shawl, kept folded for 24 years, was placed in the town archive chest beside the first ledger, the axle pin, the alkali jar, and the emergency tally sheets. Nothing remained loose. Now the wheel still turns each summer under trained hands. The failed cast-iron pump still stands behind the store as a rusting lesson in cost without fitness. The 2 communal cisterns are inspected every April and sealed every October. Children still recite the warning signs in order: early geese, weak eddies, green leaves falling, magpies at Whetstone. Cedar Bluff counts its souls, posts its reserves, and keeps duplicate keys in 4 homes. On hot afternoons when the trough begins its steady song, older voices sometimes use the phrase that once carried mockery and now carries duty. Build it like Graham's wheel, they say, and they mean build it to serve everyone when pride fails.